A private jet landing at sunrise that would not only transform a struggling farmer's destiny, but reveal a long-forgotten agricultural legacy that would revitalize an entire rural community and the remarkable connection that had remained buried for generations, all set in motion by one simple act of kindness toward a family stranded by fate on a stormy night. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless summer rain pounded against the windows of Thomas Whitaker's farmhouse as he stared at the bank notice spread across his kitchen table. At 52, the fourth-generation farmer had exhausted nearly every avenue to save the 230-acre organic farm that had been in his family since 1932, 2 consecutive seasons of unprecedented flooding, followed by this year's devastating outbreak of fungal blight, had left him with mounting debts, a severely diminished harvest he couldn't afford to bring to market, and exactly $1,976, 43 in his checking account, nowhere near enough to cover the loan payment due in just 11 days. "Dad, I made some tea," called his son Nathan from the kitchen. At 25, he had returned home after completing his agricultural sciences degree, hoping to help modernize the family farm while applying for sustainable farming grants in neighboring counties. The young man's optimism had gradually faded as each application was met with rejection or placed on extended waiting lists. "Thanks, son. Any word from the Sustainable Agriculture Foundation?" Thomas asked, folding the foreclosure notice and tucking it into his shirt pocket before Nathan could see it. "Still reviewing applications," Nathan replied, setting down the steaming mug. "But I've got a meeting with the Regional Organic Certification Board next week about potential emergency funding." The certification board? Thomas's thoughts immediately turned to the small roadside stand he'd passed yesterday on his way back from town. He'd noticed a luxury SUV with out-of-state plates pulled over, hazard lights flashing in the torrential downpour. A well-dressed family had been standing beside it, clearly stranded, the father attempting to change a flat tire in the middle of the storm, while a woman and 2 children huddled under a small travel umbrella. The sight had struck Thomas deeply, especially after recognizing the genuine distress on their faces despite their obvious wealth. "What are you thinking about?" Nathan asked, noticing his father's distant expression. Thomas hesitated, then shared the idea that had kept him awake most of the night. "Remember that section of butternut squash and heirloom tomatoes that survived the blight? Not cosmetically perfect enough for the farmer's market, but perfectly good food. I know we can't afford the labor to harvest it all." Thomas paused, his weathered hands wrapped around the warm mug. "What if instead of letting it go to waste, we offer some hospitality?" That evening, as the storm intensified and rural power lines began to fail, Thomas wasn't entirely surprised to hear the sound of tires struggling on the muddy farm access road. Nathan peered through the rain-streaked window. "Dad, it's that SUV you mentioned. Looks like they're having trouble with the hill." Thomas grabbed his rain jacket and 2 flashlights. "Let's give them a hand before they slide right back down." The rain hammered against them as father and son made their way down the slippery driveway. The luxury vehicle's wheels were spinning, helplessly in the increasingly muddy conditions, its headlights illuminating the sheets of rain. Thomas approached the driver's side window, which lowered to reveal an exhausted-looking man in his 40s. "You folks seem to be having a rough evening," Thomas said, shining his flashlight to help the driver see his face. "I'm Thomas Whitaker. This is my farm." "James Harrington," the man replied, relief evident in his voice. "We had a flat tire earlier, and now the GPS has led us down what I'm realizing isn't actually a through road. We're trying to reach Madison Falls, but the main highway is flooded according to the emergency alerts. Thomas nodded. The creek's overflowed onto Route 16. It'll be impassable until morning at the earliest. You folks have children with you. My wife, Catherine, and our kids, Emma and Tyler, James replied, gesturing to his family. The two children, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, looked tired and frightened in the back seat. Catherine offered a weary smile from the passenger seat. The nearest hotel is 30 miles back, and with the roads washing out, I don't recommend trying to make it there tonight, Thomas said. We've got plenty of room at the farmhouse. You're welcome to wait out the storm with us. James hesitated, surprised by the offer. That's incredibly kind, but we couldn't impose. It's no imposition, Thomas interrupted. Nathan here can drive your vehicle up to the house using our tractor to pull it. These access roads get tricky in weather like this if you don't know their quirks. After a brief family conference, the Harringtons accepted. Nathan attached a tow cable from their farm tractor to the SUV's frame and carefully guided the vehicle up to the farmhouse while Thomas walked alongside, helping illuminate the safest path. Inside the warm farmhouse, Catherine Harrington looked around with undisguised curiosity. Despite its age, the home was clean and well-maintained, with handmade quilts draped over comfortable furniture and walls adorned with family photographs spanning generations. Your home is lovely, she said, as Thomas handed her a towel for her rain-dampened hair. It has such history. Been in the family since my great-grandfather built it, Thomas replied. Not fancy, but we've always tried to keep it welcoming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. While Nathan showed James where to hang their wet coats, Thomas quickly put together a simple but hearty meal from what they had on hand. A vegetable soup made with produce from their garden, freshly baked bread he'd made that morning, and preserves from last season's harvest. As they gathered around the kitchen table, Emma, the younger of the Harrington children, looked skeptically at the rich orange soup. What kind of soup is this? It looks different. That's our special butternut squash soup, Thomas explained, breaking bread for their guests. Grew those squash right out there in the west field, same with the tomatoes in it. When you grow it yourself, you don't need much else to make it taste good. Tyler, the older child, took a cautious spoonful, then looked up in surprise. This is actually really good, way better than the soup we get at home. That's because it was still growing this morning, Nathan said with a smile. Can't get much fresher than that. As the meal progressed, the formality between the two families gradually dissolved. James explained that he worked in agricultural technology development. His company created software systems for large-scale farming operations to optimize water usage and reduce chemical inputs. We were on our way back from a conference in Chicago, he explained. I wanted to take the scenic route and show the kids some of the countryside. Not my best decision given the weather forecast. Sometimes detours lead us exactly where we need to be, Thomas replied. The statement carried more weight than he intended, and he quickly changed the subject. How about dessert? We've got some apple cobbler left from yesterday. After the meal, as the storm continued to rage outside, Thomas noticed Emma staring out the window toward the darkened fields. What are you looking at out there? He asked gently. I've never been on a real farm before, she admitted. In school, we're doing a project about where food comes from, but it's all just pictures, in books. Thomas smiled. Well, if the rain lets up by morning, maybe we can give you a quick tour before you folks head out, show you where that soup actually came from. Later that evening, after the Harringtons had settled into the spare bedrooms upstairs, Nathan found his father sitting at the kitchen table, calculator in hand, once again reviewing their financial situation. They seem nice, Nathan observed. Pretty different world from ours, though. Thomas nodded absently. James mentioned his company works with farms the size of entire counties. Makes our place look like a garden plot. Still, did you see how they reacted to eating vegetables that weren't from a supermarket? Nathan said, trying to lighten his father's mood. You'd think we'd performed some kind of magic trick. Thomas set aside his calculator with a sigh. Maybe there's some magic in it yet. Get some sleep, son. Morning comes early, storm or no storm. By dawn, the torrential downpour had subsided to a gentle drizzle. Thomas, already up for 2 hours tending to essential farm tasks, was surprised to find James Harrington in the kitchen, attempting to figure out the old coffee percolator. "Sorry," James said when Thomas entered. "Didn't want to wake anyone, but I'm useless without coffee." Thomas smiled and showed him how to work the percolator. Been meaning to get one of those fancy machines, but this one still does the job. It was a small lie. There had been no money for new appliances for years, but Thomas's pride wouldn't allow him to admit that. "I appreciate your hospitality," James said, leaning against the counter while the coffee brewed. "Not many people would take in strangers these days." Thomas shrugged. "My father would have done the same. Out here, we look out for each other. It's how communities survive." As the rest of the household gradually awoke, Thomas was amused to see both Harrington children dressed and eager for the promised farm tour, despite the muddy conditions outside. Even Catherine seemed genuinely interested, asking thoughtful questions about the farmhouse's history over breakfast. "If you folks don't mind getting your shoes dirty, we can show you around before you head out," Thomas offered, noticing Emma's barely contained excitement. The morning tour began with the kitchen garden near the house, then moved to the small orchard where late-season apples were still ripening. Thomas explained their organic methods, while Nathan demonstrated how they tested soil composition without chemical indicators. The Harrington family listened with surprising attention, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. When they reached the larger fields, Thomas pointed out the section of vegetables that had survived the blight. "That's where your soup came from last night. We've got about 15 acres of decent produce there, though it's not pretty enough for the commercial buyers." "What happens to it?" Catherine asked. Thomas hesitated before answering honestly. "Most of it will probably go to waste. We can't afford the labor to harvest it all, and the local food bank has limited refrigeration capacity. It's a shame, but that's the reality of farming sometimes." James frowned slightly, studying the field. "That seems like an awful lot of food to go to waste." "It is," Thomas acknowledged. "It's one of the hardest parts of the job, watching good food rot because the economics don't work out." As they completed the tour near the old barn, Emma tugged at her father's sleeve, whispering something. James smiled and nodded before addressing Thomas. "Would it be possible? Could we perhaps take some of your vegetables with us?" Emma's quite taken with the idea of having more of that soup, and Tyler wants to show his science class where real food comes from. Thomas felt a genuine smile spread across his face. The first in weeks. "I think we can manage that. Nathan, why don't you grab some harvest baskets from the shed?" What began as a simple gesture quickly evolved into something more substantial. James and Catherine rolled up their sleeves and joined Thomas and Nathan in carefully selecting and harvesting a variety of vegetables. The children, initially hesitant about the mud, soon became enthusiastic participants, marveling at pulling carrots from the ground and discovering the rainbow of heirloom tomato varieties. "I had no idea tomatoes could be purple," Emma exclaimed, carefully placing one in her basket as though it were a precious gem. As the impromptu harvest continued, Thomas noticed James taking periodic phone calls, stepping away briefly before rejoining the group. Around mid-morning, James approached Thomas with an unexpectedly serious expression. "Thomas, I hope this isn't overstepping, but I've been making some calls. My company works with several organic food distributors. Would you be opposed to having one of their representatives come take a look at your remaining crop? They specifically work with imperfect produce for restaurant supply chains that care more about flavor than appearance. Thomas felt a complex mixture of emotions, hope, pride, and a touch of embarrassment at having his difficulties so transparently addressed. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "I suppose there's no harm in having someone take a look." By noon, the Harringtons' SUV was packed with carefully arranged produce, far more than they had initially intended to take. As they prepared to depart, the road to Madison Falls having been declared passable again, Catherine embraced Thomas warmly. "You've shown our family something invaluable," she said. "My children now understand what it actually means to grow food with care." James shook Thomas's hand firmly. "Expect a call about that distributor within the next few days. And thank you, not just for the shelter, but for reminding us what matters." As the luxury vehicle disappeared down the farm road, Nathan stood beside his father. "Nice folks," he observed. "Think anything will come of that distributor contact?" Thomas shrugged, not wanting to nurture false hope. "Maybe. Either way, it felt good to share the harvest with someone who appreciated it." That evening, after a simple dinner, Thomas finally showed Nathan the foreclosure notice he'd been hiding. "I didn't want to worry you, but you deserve to know where we stand. Unless something changes dramatically in the next 10 days, we'll lose the farm." Nathan stared at the document, the color draining from his face. "Dad, why didn't you tell me it had gotten this bad?" "Because you came home to help innovate, not to watch the place go under," Thomas replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I've tried everything I know. The bank won't extend our loan again, and we don't have enough sellable crop to make the payment." "What about the distributor James mentioned?" Nathan asked, grasping at hope. "Even if they're interested, these things take time. The payment's due next week." Thomas ran a hand through his graying hair. "I think we need to start talking about what comes next. There's a decent agricultural program at the community college where you could finish your degree, and my brother might have a spare room where I could—" "No," Nathan interrupted firmly. "We're not giving up yet. James seemed serious about those contacts, and the certification board might come through with emergency funding. We still have 10 days. Thomas managed a tired smile, touched by his son's determination even as he recognized its futility. "All right, 10 more days of fighting the good fight." What Thomas Whitaker couldn't possibly know, as he finally drifted off to sleep that night, was that his spontaneous act of kindness toward a stranded family had set in motion events that would not only change his farm's future, but would uncover a long-forgotten agricultural legacy that would transform the entire community's understanding of sustainable farming. And that the well-dressed stranger who had helped harvest vegetables in mud-splattered designer shoes was far more than he appeared to be. 3 days later, Thomas was repairing an irrigation line when Nathan called to him from across the field, waving urgently. "Dad! Come quick, you need to see this!" Thomas hurried over, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Nathan replied, his expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "But there are 3 vehicles coming up the access road. One of them has organic heritage distributors on the side, and there's a guy in a suit with them." Thomas frowned, squinting toward the approaching vehicles. "Probably just that distributor contact James mentioned. No need to get worked up." But as the vehicles drew closer, Thomas felt his own pulse quicken. The lead car was a sleek black sedan that screamed corporate executive, followed by what appeared to be a refrigerated delivery truck with professional signage, and behind them, a vehicle that looked suspiciously like a mobile soil testing lab he'd seen at agricultural fairs but could never afford to hire. "Were you expecting an entire delegation?" Nathan asked, a nervous edge to his voice. "Just roll with it," Thomas muttered, suddenly conscious of his mud-stained work clothes and the general disrepair of the farm's infrastructure. "Maybe they're lost." The vehicles pulled into the turnaround near the barn, and Thomas approached. with the practiced casualness of someone trying not to appear desperate. From the black sedan emerged a tall woman in a tailored business suit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a professional bun. She extended her hand with a confident smile. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm Eleanor Vaughan, Chief Sustainability Officer at Harrington Agricultural Technologies. James Harrington asked me to personally follow up regarding your produce situation." Thomas shook her hand, acutely aware of his calloused palm against her manicured fingers. "Ms. Vaughan, I wasn't expecting quite such a comprehensive response." Eleanor's smile widened slightly. James was quite insistent. He said your butternut squash changed his daughter's relationship with vegetables overnight, something her pediatrician has been trying to accomplish for years. From the delivery truck emerged a man with a clipboard and the weathered complexion of someone who understood farming from experience rather than theory. "Martin Rodriguez, head buyer for Organic Heritage," he introduced himself. "Hope you don't mind us dropping in like this, but when we heard about heirloom varieties being grown with traditional methods, we wanted to move quickly. Our restaurant clients are always searching for produce with authentic flavor profiles." Before Thomas could formulate a response, the soil testing vehicle's door opened to reveal a younger woman in practical field clothes, sporting colorful tattoos of plant species on her visible forearms. "Dr. Amara Jackson, soil biologist," she introduced herself with a casual wave. "I specialize in organic soil rehabilitation and heirloom crop preservation. Mr. Harrington mentioned you've maintained organic practices through 4 generations." Thomas felt as though he'd stumbled into someone else's reality. "That's correct, though we've never been able to afford official certification. My great-grandfather started this farm believing chemicals would eventually deplete the land. Everyone thought he was crazy back then." Dr. Jackson's eyes lit up. "Visionary is the word I'd use. Do you have any of his original farming journals or records?" "In the attic somewhere," Thomas replied, increasingly bewildered by the interest. These professionals were showing in his struggling operation. "My grandmother kept everything." Eleanor stepped forward, gracefully taking control of the situation. "Mr. Whitaker, we'd like to conduct a comprehensive assessment of your current crop, soil conditions, and farming methodologies. With your permission, Martin would like to evaluate your harvest for immediate purchase, while Dr. Jackson examines your soil biology. I'm here to discuss potential longer-term arrangements, should everything align with our sustainable agriculture initiatives." Thomas exchanged a quick glance with Nathan, whose expression mirrored his own cautious hope. "Of course. You're welcome to look around. Though I should mention the farm isn't at its best right now. We've had some financial challenges." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening slightly. "James mentioned you might be facing some difficult decisions. We understand the realities of independent farming in today's economy. That's actually part of why we're here." For the next several hours, the Whitaker farm buzzed with unprecedented activity. Martin methodically assessed the fields of imperfect but flavorful produce, occasionally exclaiming over particularly impressive specimens. Dr. Jackson collected soil samples across the property, her specialized equipment analyzing compositions on the spot, while she peppered Thomas with questions about rotation practices and natural pest management techniques. Eleanor, meanwhile, requested a tour of the entire operation, taking detailed notes and occasionally stepping away for brief phone calls. Her questions were incisive, focusing not just on current practices, but on the farm's history and Thomas's vision for its future, a future he had almost given up on imagining. By late afternoon, the 3 visitors gathered near their vehicles, conferring quietly, while Thomas and Nathan waited, with the uncomfortable feeling of having their entire livelihood evaluated in hushed tones. Finally, Eleanor approached, her professional demeanor now tinged with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. Mr. Whitaker, we'd like to make you an immediate proposal. Martin is prepared to purchase your entire current harvest, imperfections and all, at premium organic rates. Dr. Jackson has confirmed that your soil biology is, in her words, a living museum of pre-industrial agricultural practices that warrants further study and potentially academic publication. Thomas blinked, struggling to process her words. The entire harvest? But some of it doesn't meet commercial standards for appearance. Martin stepped forward. Mr. Whitaker, I supply restaurants where chefs care about flavor compounds and nutritional density, not whether a tomato is perfectly round. Your heirloom varieties have characteristics that have been bred out of commercial produce for decades. That's exactly what we're looking for. As for the soil analysis, Dr. Jackson added, you've maintained biodiversity that most modern farms have lost entirely. Do you realize you have mycelium networks that barely exist anymore in commercial farming environments? This is living agricultural history. Thomas struggled to find words, overwhelmed by this sudden reversal of fortune. That's certainly welcome news. The harvest sale would help tremendously. Eleanor's expression became more serious. There's something else, Mr. Whitaker. Based on our preliminary assessment, Harrington Agricultural Technologies would like to discuss a potential partnership program. We're developing a heritage farming initiative to preserve traditional agricultural methods while making them economically viable in the modern market. Your farm represents exactly the kind of operation we're looking to support. Nathan, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. What kind of partnership are you talking about exactly? Initially, we would provide immediate financial stabilization through harvest purchase and soil consultation services, Eleanor explained. Longer term, we envision technological support that complements rather than replaces your traditional methods, guaranteed purchase agreements for future harvests, and potentially using portions of your land as a living laboratory for agricultural students, all while you maintain full ownership and operational control. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. That sounds almost too good to be true. Eleanor smiled with understanding. I'm sure it does, which is why Mr. Harrington suggested I bring this with me. She handed Thomas an envelope bearing an official bank seal. This is confirmation that Harrington Agricultural Technologies has deposited a good faith advance payment for your current harvest. It should be sufficient to address any immediate financial concerns while we formalize the details of a longer-term arrangement. With slightly shaking hands, Thomas opened the envelope and stared at the check inside. The amount was more than double what he needed to make the overdue loan payment. He looked up, meeting Eleanor's steady gaze. Why? He asked simply. Why? Is your company doing this? Eleanor's professional veneer softened slightly. Mr. Whitaker, the agricultural industry is at a crossroads. We've spent decades pursuing efficiency at the expense of sustainability, standardization at the cost of biodiversity. Companies like ours have contributed to that problem. Now we're investing in solutions, and people like you who never lost sight of what farming should be. As the visitors prepared to depart, promises were made for return visits, formal agreements, and immediate harvest collection. Thomas stood in his driveway, the check still in his hand, watching the vehicles disappear down the access road. "Dad!" Nathan's voice broke through his daze. "Is this really happening?" Thomas stared at the check, then at the fields that had been in his family for generations, fields he had been preparing to lose forever. It seems to be, though I still don't understand why the Harringtons would go to such lengths for people. They met by accident. Maybe it wasn't an accident, Nathan suggested quietly. You chose to help strangers when you had almost nothing to give, that kind of thing. It matters to some people. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon where the vehicles had disappeared. I suppose it does. Come on, son. We've got a loan payment to make, and then it seems we have a farm to save after all. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch swing watching the sunset paint the fields with golden light, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Answering, he was surprised to hear James Harrington's voice. "Thomas, I hope Eleanor and her team didn't overwhelm you today. They can be rather thorough." "Mr. Harrington," Thomas replied, still processing the day's events. "I don't quite know how to thank you for what you've done. The harvest purchase alone will save our farm." James's voice carried a smile. "Please, it's James, and there's no need for thanks. What you offered my family, genuine hospitality with no expectation of return, that's increasingly rare in this world. The truth is, Thomas, you have something my company has been searching for, authentic connection to agricultural traditions that have nearly disappeared." "It's just how my family has always farmed," Thomas said simply. "Exactly," James replied. "And that's precisely why I'd like to discuss something more significant with you. Eleanor mentioned our heritage farming initiative, but there's a broader vision I'd prefer to explain in person." He paused briefly. "Would you be willing to visit our research facility next week? I'll send transportation, of course." Thomas hesitated, the day's surprises already pushing the boundaries of his usually practical worldview. "I suppose we could drive up if you provide directions." James chuckled lightly. "Actually, I was thinking of something a bit more direct. My company has a private airfield about 40 miles from you. I could have a plane there Tuesday morning if that works for your schedule." Thomas nearly dropped the phone. "A plane for a farm consultation. Time is valuable, Thomas, and what we'd like to show you can't be adequately explained over the phone. Besides," James added with warmth in his voice, "I promised Emma she could show you how the butternut squash soup turned out from her first attempt at cooking. She's quite proud of it." Still struggling to adjust to this new reality, Thomas found himself agreeing to the visit. As he ended the call and stared out at his fields that would now remain in his family's care, he couldn't help but marvel at how completely his fortune had reversed from offering simple shelter to strangers on a stormy night. What Thomas Whitaker didn't yet realize was that the private jet, scheduled to arrive Tuesday morning, would bring not just a business opportunity, but the revelation of an agricultural legacy that had been quietly waiting for generations to be rediscovered. A legacy that would soon transform not just his farm, but the entire community's relationship with the land and its history. The morning light filtered through parting clouds as Thomas Whitaker stood in his farmyard, watching a sleek private jet descend from the sky. Its polished exterior gleamed against the backdrop of blue that had replaced yesterday's storm clouds, the Harrington Agricultural Technologies logo emblazoned on its tail. Having spent his entire life with his feet firmly planted in the soil, Thomas had never imagined that he would be boarding a private aircraft, especially not as an honored guest rather than hired help. "Nervous?" Nathan asked, joining his father, as they watched the plane touch down on the small regional airstrip. "Not about the flying," Thomas admitted, straightening his one good shirt for the third time. "More about why a company like Harrington AgTech would invest so much in a failing farm like ours. There's got to be a catch somewhere." Nathan's expression softened. "Dad, you've spent so many years expecting the worst that you can't recognize when something good is actually happening. Maybe this really is what it seems. People who see value in what we've been doing all along." The deposit from the emergency harvest purchase had cleared the previous day. Thomas had immediately driven to the bank, paid the overdue loan installment, and for the first time in years, returned home without the crushing weight of imminent foreclosure pressing down on him. But temporary relief was not the same as sustainable security, and Thomas had spent too many years watching neighboring family farms disappear to trust in sudden miracles. As the jet completed its taxiing and came to a stop, a ground crew quickly positioned a mobile staircase against its gleaming fuselage. The door opened to reveal James Harrington himself, dressed in casual business attire rather than the rain-soaked clothes Thomas had first encountered him in. "Thomas? Nathan? Welcome!" James called, descending the stairs with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to private air travel. "I'm so glad you could make it. We have quite a day planned for you." Thomas shook James's extended hand, acutely, aware of the contrast between his weathered, calloused palm and the executive's smoother grip. "Mr. Harrington—" "James, please," the man interrupted warmly. "James," Thomas corrected himself. "This is all very generous, but I'm still not clear on exactly what your company wants from us." A slight smile played at the corners of James's mouth. "Direct and honest, exactly the qualities Eleanor mentioned. Let's talk on the way. The flight's only about an hour, and I have some materials I'd like to show you." As they boarded the aircraft, Thomas tried not to appear overwhelmed by the luxurious interior. Soft leather seats, polished wood tables, and technology he couldn't even name filled the cabin. Nathan, less inhibited by pride, let out a low whistle of appreciation. "This is something else," the younger man commented, running his hand along a burnished tabletop. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," James said, gesturing to a seating area where documents were already arranged beside a coffee service. "Catherine and the kids send their regards, by the way. Emma's been experimenting with your vegetables. All week, our kitchen looks like a science project gone wrong, but she's never been so interested in food." As the jet began its takeoff sequence, James poured coffee for all of them and opened a leather portfolio. "I promised you answers, Thomas, so let me start with the most important one. What does Harrington AgTech want from Whitaker Farm?" The short answer is authenticity. "Authenticity?" Thomas repeated, his brow furrowing. "Let me explain where we are as a company," James continued, sliding several glossy reports across the table. "Harrington Agricultural Technologies began 30 years ago developing irrigation software. We've grown into one of the largest agricultural technology providers in the country, with systems operating on millions of acres worldwide." Thomas nodded. He knew this much from his conversation with James during the storm. "What most people don't know," James continued, his expression growing more serious, "is that we're facing a crisis of our own making. Our technologies have helped large agricultural operations become incredibly efficient, but at a cost we didn't fully appreciate until recently." "Soil degradation," Nathan interjected, demonstrating his agricultural education. "Biodiversity, collapse, nutrient depletion." James nodded, looking impressed. "Exactly. Modern farming produces tremendous yields, but the ecological invoice is coming due. Our own research shows that within 20 years, many of the massive operations using our technology will face critical soil failure if practices don't change dramatically." Thomas considered this as he sipped his coffee. "That's been obvious to small farmers for decades. My great-grandfather used to say you can't keep making withdrawals from the soil without making deposits back into it." "Your great-grandfather was prescient," James replied, his expression thoughtful. "And that brings me to why we're so interested in Whitaker Farm. Our company has been searching for operations that have maintained traditional sustainable practices through generations, living proof that there are alternatives to the industrial model we've helped propagate. There are organic farms all over the country," Thomas pointed out, "many with better yields and more sophisticated operations than ours." "True," James acknowledged, "but most of those are relatively recent conversions to organic methods. What Dr. Jackson found on your property is fundamentally different. soil biomes that have never been exposed to industrial agriculture, cultivation methods that have been passed down in continuity for nearly a century, and heirloom seed stock that's become increasingly rare. The jet had reached its cruising altitude, the farmland below now a patchwork quilt of varying shades of green and brown. Thomas gazed out the window, trying to process James's words. "So you're saying our farm is valuable because we've been too poor to modernize?" he asked, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from his voice. James shook his head. "I'm saying your farm is valuable because your family had the wisdom and foresight to resist short-term gains for long-term sustainability. What others might see as falling behind, we see as preserving something precious that the rest of the agricultural world is now desperate to recover." Nathan leaned forward, his expression animated. "So the Heritage Farming Initiative Ms. Vaughan mentioned, it's about learning from farms like ours." "It's about far more than learning," James replied, his eyes alight with what appeared to be genuine passion. "It's about preservation, revitalization, and ultimately transformation of the entire agricultural sector." For the remainder of the flight, James outlined a vision that seemed almost too ambitious to be credible. Harrington AgTech was investing billions in what they called regenerative retrofitting, developing technologies that would help industrial farms transition back toward more sustainable practices without catastrophic yield reductions. Key to this strategy was establishing a network of heritage farms that would serve as living laboratories, training centers, and seed stock preserves. "We need anchor farms with intact traditional knowledge and uncontaminated soil biomes," James explained. "Places where we can study what healthy agricultural ecosystems should actually look like, and where we can train a new generation of farmers in methods that blend traditional wisdom with appropriate technology." Indeed, as the jet began its descent, Thomas found himself torn between hope and skepticism. "This all sounds wonderful in theory, but what exactly are you proposing for our farm specifically?" James smiled. "That's what today is about. I want to show you the research facility first, then we'll discuss the specific opportunities we envision for Whitaker Farm." The Harrington Agricultural Research Campus sprawled across what had once been a traditional farm itself, though most of the original buildings had been replaced with modern glass and steel structures. Solar arrays gleamed on every rooftop, and experimental crop fields were interspersed with research greenhouses. The jet landed on a private airstrip at the edge of the property, where an electric vehicle awaited them. "Welcome to what we hope is the future of farming," James said, as they climbed into the vehicle. "Though I'll admit, it doesn't look much like your place." The tour began in what James called the Heritage Seed Vault, a climate-controlled facility housing thousands of heirloom crop varieties. Dr. Amara Jackson met them there, her face lighting up with genuine enthusiasm when she saw the Whitakers. "The soil samples we took from your farm have been absolute gold," she exclaimed, leading them through secure doors into a laboratory where technicians were analyzing data on large screens. "We've identified 7 distinct mycelium networks that were thought to be functionally extinct in agricultural settings. Do you have any idea how significant that is?" Before Thomas could reply, she continued excitedly. "And the seed stock evaluation. 3 of your tomato varieties don't match anything in our existing catalog. We think they might be unique cultivars, developed by your family and preserved through generations of careful seed saving." Thomas felt a strange mixture of pride and confusion. The practices Dr. Jackson described with such reverence were simply what his family had always done, saving the best seeds each year, rotating crops to maintain soil health, using natural predators to control pests rather than chemicals. These weren't revolutionary techniques. They were the basic farming practices his great-grandfather had established and subsequent generations had maintained out of both tradition and necessity. Dr. Jackson's enthusiasm might seem excessive, James commented with a smile as they moved on, but it reflects how far conventional agriculture has strayed from sound practices. What's commonplace on your farm has become extraordinary in the broader agricultural world. The tour continued through laboratories where scientists were developing technologies to restore soil health on industrial farms, greenhouses where experimental crop rotations were being tested, and finally to a demonstration field where traditional farming implements had been adapted with modern sensors and data collection systems. We call this appropriate technology integration, James explained, showing them a horse-drawn plow fitted with soil analysis sensors. The goal isn't to replace traditional methods, but to enhance them with targeted data collection that helps farmers make more informed decisions. By midday, they reached what appeared to be a beautifully restored farmhouse at the center of the campus. Inside, they found a comfortable dining room where a meal awaited them, featuring, Thomas was surprised to discover, produce from their own farm. The butternut squash soup is Emma's recipe, James explained as they seated themselves, though our chef helped with the execution. As they enjoyed the meal, prepared with remarkable skill to highlight the natural flavors of the Whitaker farm vegetables, Eleanor Vaughan joined them. She carried a tablet and several folders, which she set aside as she greeted Thomas and Nathan warmly. "I hope the morning tour has been illuminating," she said, taking a seat beside James. "Has he explained our vision for the Heritage Farm Network yet?" "In broad strokes," James replied. "I thought we'd get into the specifics over lunch." What followed was a detailed presentation of what Harrington AgTech proposed for Whitaker Farm, a multifaceted partnership that seemed almost too good to be true. The company would provide immediate financial stabilization through a comprehensive debt clearance program, followed by infrastructure improvements that would maintain the farm's traditional character while upgrading critical systems. "We're not looking to turn your farm into a technology showcase," Eleanor emphasized, seemingly reading Thomas's concerns. "The value is in its authenticity. We want to preserve what makes it special while ensuring it becomes economically sustainable." The proposal included establishing a training program where farmers seeking to transition to organic methods could learn directly from the Whitakers, creating a heritage seed production operation that would provide premium income from the farm's heirloom varieties and installing minimally invasive monitoring systems that would gather data on soil health and biodiversity without disrupting traditional farming practices. In return, James explained, Harrington AgTech would receive access to your family's agricultural knowledge, permission to conduct non-invasive research on your land, and the right to use Whitaker Farm as a case study in our broader regenerative agriculture initiatives. Thomas sipped his water, processing the enormity of what was being proposed. "And ownership of the farm remains entirely with your family," Eleanor replied firmly. "We're not interested in acquisition. This partnership only works if the Whitaker family continues to operate the farm according to your traditional practices. We're simply providing the financial stability and technological support to make that sustainable in today's economy." Nathan, who had been taking notes throughout the presentation, looked up with cautious optimism. "What about decision-making? Who would determine what crops we plant or how we manage the land? Day-to-day operations would remain completely under your control," James assured him. "The partnership agreement would include provisions to ensure the farm's traditional methods are preserved, which is in everyone's interest. But specific crop selection, rotation planning, and management decisions would be yours. And if we wanted to end the partnership, Thomas asked, still searching for the hidden catch. There would be a reasonable exit clause, Eleanor acknowledged, though we'd hope the relationship would prove beneficial enough that you wouldn't want to. But yes, the agreement would include provisions for either party to terminate with appropriate notice and transition support. As lunch concluded, James suggested a walk around the demonstration fields to allow Thomas and Nathan some time to discuss privately. When they were out of earshot of the Harrington executives, Nathan turned to his father with barely contained excitement. "Dad, do you realize what they're offering? They're essentially saying they'll pay off the farm's debts, upgrade our infrastructure, and create multiple new revenue streams, all while letting us continue farming exactly the way we always have." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression guarded. "It sounds perfect. That's what worries me. In my experience, when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is." "Maybe," Nathan conceded, "but what if it's not? What if this is one of those rare moments when being right all along finally gets recognized and rewarded?" Thomas gazed across the experimental fields, where researchers were carefully tending crops using methods that looked surprisingly similar to practices his family had maintained for generations. There was a certain irony in the fact that what Harrington AgTech presented as cutting-edge regenerative agriculture was essentially what the Whitakers had been doing all along, out of both principle and necessity. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Thomas admitted. "For them to say, 'Oh, and by the way, we'll need you to start using this chemical or that technology,' but they seem genuinely committed to preserving exactly what we've been doing. Because what we've been doing is actually valuable," Nathan replied, "more valuable than we realized. Dad, your stubborn insistence on maintaining great-grandpa's methods might just have saved more than our farm. It might help change agriculture itself." Thomas wasn't entirely convinced, but he had to admit that everything he'd seen today suggested Harrington AgTech's interest was genuine. The research he'd observed was focused on restoring precisely the kind of sustainable agricultural systems his family had maintained through 4 generations. If there was an ulterior motive, it wasn't immediately apparent. As they completed their circuit of the demonstration field, James and Eleanor rejoined them, accompanied now by a distinguished older man Thomas hadn't met before. He walked with the assistance of a carved wooden cane, but carried himself with the unmistakable posture of someone accustomed to authority. "Thomas, Nathan," James said, "I'd like you to meet my father, William Harrington, the founder of Harrington Agricultural Technologies." The older man extended his hand with a warm smile. "Mr. Whitaker, it's a pleasure to meet you. James has told me about your farm and your family's commitment to traditional methods. I've been looking forward to this meeting." Thomas shook the offered hand, noting the strength still evident in the older man's grip despite his apparent age. "Mr. Harrington, your son has been very generous with his time and interest in our operation." "Please call me William," the older man replied, "and it's not generosity driving our interest, it's necessity. May I speak frankly with you?" Thomas nodded, intrigued by the patriarch's direct approach. William gestured toward a nearby bench, overlooking the research fields. "Let's sit for a moment. These old knees aren't what they used to be." As they settled on the bench, William gazed thoughtfully across the experimental crops before speaking. "Mr. Whitaker, I built this company on a simple premise. The technology could make farming more efficient and productive. For decades, we've succeeded beyond my wildest expectations, helping transform American agriculture into the most productive system in human history." He paused, his expression growing somber. "What I failed to anticipate was the ecological cost of that transformation. We've been treating soil like a medium for chemical inputs rather than a living ecosystem. The consequences are becoming increasingly dire." Thomas nodded. This matched what James had described earlier. 3 years ago," William continued, I was diagnosed with cancer. During my treatment, I had plenty of time to reflect on my legacy. I realized that unless we dramatically change course, history might remember Harrington Agricultural Technologies not as the company that helped feed the world, but as the company that helped destroy the very foundations of sustainable food production. The older man's candor was unexpected, and Thomas found himself drawn in by his evident sincerity. When I recovered, I redirected the company's research focus toward what we now call regenerative agriculture, William explained. But we quickly discovered a fundamental problem. There were precious few examples left of truly healthy agricultural ecosystems. Most farmland has been subjected to decades of industrial practices. Finding uncontaminated reference points became our most urgent challenge. And that's where farms like ours come in, Nathan suggested. William nodded, his eyes crinkling with approval. Precisely. Farms that have maintained traditional methods through generations are living libraries of agricultural wisdom and biological diversity. They're incredibly rare and increasingly valuable. He turned to face Thomas directly. Mr. Whitaker, I understand your skepticism. You've spent decades being told your methods were outdated, only to now have corporate executives telling you they're actually visionary. That's quite a whiplash. Thomas couldn't help but smile at the accurate assessment. It is a bit disorienting, he admitted. Let me tell you why I personally wanted to meet you today, William continued. The partnership my son and Eleanor have outlined is indeed favorable to your farm, deliberately so. But it's not charity. Your farm represents something of immense value to our company's mission and potentially to the future of agriculture itself. He gestured toward the horizon, where the research campus gave way to conventional farmland. Out there, millions of acres are headed toward biological collapse. The farmers operating those acres need viable alternatives, not just theoretical papers from academics, but living examples of functional, regenerative systems. Your farm could become one of the most important teaching facilities in our entire network. As the afternoon sun began its descent, William Harrington shared his personal vision for the Heritage Farm Network, a vision that placed operations, like Whitaker Farm, at the center of a fundamental transformation in American agriculture. What had begun as a chance encounter during a storm was revealing itself as an opportunity far more significant than Thomas had imagined. We're not just offering to save one farm, William concluded, his voice carrying the weight of genuine conviction. We're asking you to help us save farming itself. As they prepared to board the jet for the return flight, Thomas found himself viewing his family's struggling operation through entirely new eyes. What he had considered their greatest liability, the inability to modernize with expensive equipment and chemical programs, was apparently their greatest asset. The very practices that had marginalized them in the industrial agricultural economy now positioned them as potential leaders in whatever came next. The return flight was quieter, with Thomas and Nathan both lost in thought about the day's revelations. James respected their need to process, focusing on answering specific questions rather than further promotion of the partnership concept. As the jet began its descent toward the small regional airfield, James handed Thomas a sealed envelope. This contains the formal partnership proposal, including all financial details and legal protections. Take your time reviewing it. Have your own attorney look it over. We want you to be completely comfortable with every aspect of this relationship. Thomas accepted the envelope, still struggling to fully believe the transformation taking place. James, I have to ask, of all the small heritage farms still operating, why did you come to us specifically? Was it really just the chance encounter during the storm? James smiled thoughtfully. The storm was certainly serendipitous, but not entirely coincidental. Harrington AgTech has been mapping potential heritage operations across the country. Your farm was already on our list for evaluation, though probably not for immediate contact. He leaned back in his seat, his expression becoming more reflective. But sometimes the universe has its own timeline. When my family ended up at your table, eating food grown with such obvious care and integrity, it accelerated our interest considerably. As the jet touched down, Thomas gazed out the window at the familiar landscape of his home region. Rolling hills, patchwork fields, and in the distance, the weathered buildings of Whitaker Farm. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider a future where that land might not just survive, but thrive. "Whatever you decide," James said, as they prepared to disembark, "I want to thank you for maintaining what your great-grandfather started. Men like him understood something fundamental about our relationship with the land, something the rest of us are only now rediscovering, perhaps just in time." Standing on the tarmac as the jet prepared for departure, Nathan turned to his father with an expression of cautious hope. "So what do you think, Dad? Is this for real?" Thomas watched the sleek aircraft taxi away, the setting sun glinting off its polished exterior. The envelope in his hand contained what appeared to be a lifeline, not just for their family's farm, but for the agricultural legacy his ancestors had preserved through decades of struggle and sacrifice. "I think," he said slowly, "that your great-grandfather might be having the last laugh after all. Everyone called him foolish for refusing to adopt chemical agriculture. Turns out he might have been the wisest one of all." What Thomas Whitaker didn't yet realize was that the partnership proposal in his hands contained more than financial rescue and technological support. Hidden within its details was evidence of a connection between the Harrington and Whitaker families that stretched back nearly a century, a connection that would soon reveal why his farm had been of particular interest to the Harrington family, long before the storm that brought them to his door. 1 week had passed since Thomas and Nathan's remarkable journey aboard the Harrington private jet, and the Whitaker farmhouse kitchen table now bore a very different collection of papers than the foreclosure notice that had weighed so heavily before. Legal documents, partnership agreements, and architectural renderings for subtle farm improvements were spread across the weathered oak surface, as Thomas sat with his attorney Marion Jenkins, a sharp-minded woman who had represented many local farmers through difficult times. "I've gone through every clause, every footnote, and every appendix," Marion said, removing her reading glasses and fixing Thomas with a direct gaze. "In 27 years of practicing agricultural law, I've never seen an agreement this favorable to a family farm. Usually I'm helping clients find the hidden traps in corporate partnerships. With this one, I've been looking for the catch, and I simply can't find it." Thomas nodded slowly, still struggling to fully believe the transformation of his circumstances. "So you're saying we should sign?" "From a legal perspective, absolutely," Marion replied, gathering her notes. "The financial package alone would secure the farm's future for generations. The infrastructure improvements maintain your property's character while addressing critical needs. And most importantly, the operational autonomy provisions are ironclad. They cannot dictate your farming practices or take control of the land under any circumstances." Nathan, who had been silently listening from his position by the window, turned to face them. "And the heritage farm designation? What does that commit? Us too?" Marion flipped through her notes. "Essentially to continue what your family has always done: maintain organic practices, preserve seed stock, document traditional methods, and allow non-invasive soil monitoring. In exchange, you receive premium pricing for your produce, access to a global market for your heritage seeds, and substantial compensation for hosting occasional training workshops." She closed her folder decisively. "Thomas, the only reason not to sign this would be if you don't want to continue farming." After Marion departed, Thomas stepped onto the porch, gazing across fields that had been in his family for nearly a century. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the land, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to see not just its present struggle, but its future potential. "What are you thinking?" Nathan asked, joining him with 2 mugs of coffee. Thomas accepted the offered cup, warming his hands around it despite the mild day. "I'm thinking about your great-grandfather, about what he would make of all this. He'd probably say he told everyone so," Nathan suggested with a slight smile. "That someday people would recognize the value of working with nature instead of trying to dominate it." Thomas nodded. Probably would. But he was also deeply suspicious of corporations and their promises. Lived through the Depression, saw what happened when farmers became too dependent on forces beyond their control. "This is different, though," Nathan argued gently. "The agreement preserves our independence while giving us the resources to thrive. And the world has changed. These sustainable practices aren't just idealistic anymore. They're becoming necessary." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Thomas looked up to see a familiar black SUV approaching, this time accompanied by a work truck bearing the Harrington Agricultural Technologies logo. They hadn't been expecting visitors today. Eleanor Vaughan emerged from the SUV, dressed more casually than in their previous meetings, but still carrying her ever-present tablet. From the work truck came Dr. Jackson and a man Thomas didn't recognize, who began unloading what appeared to be specialized equipment. "Mr. Whitaker," Eleanor called as she approached the porch, "I hope we're not intruding. We were in the region for another project and wanted to follow up in person. Have you had a chance to review the partnership proposal?" Thomas nodded, gesturing toward the house. "Our attorney just left. She seems to think it's the deal of the century." Eleanor smiled. "Smart lawyer. Is Dr. Jackson bothering you by setting up her equipment?" "She's been practically haunting the labs waiting for permission to begin a more comprehensive soil biome study." Thomas glanced toward the enthusiastic soil scientist, who was already kneeling at the edge of the nearest field, carefully collecting samples. "She's welcome to it, though I'm not sure what's so exciting about our dirt. That dirt contains microbial communities that could revolutionize how we understand soil rehabilitation," Eleanor replied. "But that's not actually why I'm here today. There's something we'd like to show you, something we discovered during the deep background research for the partnership documentation." She reached into her leather portfolio and removed a faded photograph encased in a protective sleeve. "This was in the Harrington family archives. We think you might find it interesting." Thomas accepted the photograph with care immediately, recognizing its age from the sepia tones and formal composition. It showed 2 men standing beside an early model tractor, perhaps from the 1930s. One wore overalls and a weather-beaten hat, the other a more formal suit despite the agricultural setting. Both looked directly at the camera with the serious expressions common in photographs of that era. "That's my great-grandfather," Thomas said with surprise, recognizing Joseph Whitaker's features that had been passed down through generations. "But I don't recognize the other man." "That," Eleanor said quietly, "is William Harrington's father, Edward Harrington, the original founder of what would eventually become Harrington Agricultural Supply and later Harrington Agricultural Technologies." Thomas looked up sharply. "What?" Eleanor nodded. "During the legal documentation process, our historical research team discovered something remarkable. Your family and the Harrington family have a connection that predates all of us. This photograph was taken in 1934, during the height of the Dust Bowl crisis." Nathan leaned in, studying the photograph with newfound interest. "How did they know each other? And why were they together on our farm?" "That's where the story gets interesting," Eleanor replied. May we come inside? There's more to share, and Dr. Jackson will be occupied with her soil samples for hours. In the farmhouse kitchen, Eleanor connected her tablet to a portable projector. She'd brought along, dimming the blinds to allow the images to appear clearly on the wall. What I'm about to show you hasn't been shared outside the Harrington family and company historians. William Harrington only recently authorized its release as part of this partnership initiative. The first projected image showed a devastating scene, a farm completely overwhelmed by dust, buildings partially buried, fields destroyed by the ecological catastrophe that had defined the 1930s. This was the original Harrington family farm in Oklahoma, 1933, Eleanor explained. Like thousands of others, it was effectively destroyed by soil erosion and dust storms resulting from inappropriate farming practices across the region. Edward Harrington, who had inherited the farm from his father, lost nearly everything. She advanced to the next image, a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Agricultural Conference Promotes New Methods to Combat Soil Erosion." In desperation, Edward traveled the country seeking solutions. He attended this conference in Chicago, where agricultural scientists were presenting early research on sustainable farming methods to prevent another Dust Bowl. One of the presenters was a farmer from Pennsylvania who had maintained traditional practices that preserved soil health even in difficult conditions. "My great-grandfather," Thomas said softly, beginning to understand. Eleanor nodded. Joseph Whitaker was apparently quite outspoken at this conference, challenging the prevailing wisdom that modern mechanical farming was inherently superior. He advocated for what we would now call regenerative methods, crop rotation, cover cropping, minimal tillage, and maintaining soil biome health. The next image showed another newspaper photograph of the same two men from the earlier picture, this time speaking animatedly to a small crowd. Edward was deeply impressed by Joseph's arguments and evidence. According to Harrington family journals, he visited this farm after the conference to see the methods in practice. What he witnessed here changed his entire perspective on agriculture. Nathan leaned forward, fascinated by this unexpected historical connection. "So my great-great-grandfather influenced the Harrington Company's founder?" "More than influenced," Eleanor continued, advancing to another document, what appeared to be a handwritten agreement on faded paper. "This is a partnership contract between Edward Harrington and Joseph Whitaker, dated 1935. Edward, having lost his farm but still possessing some capital and mechanical expertise, proposed a collaboration. He would provide equipment and financial support to the Whitaker farm in exchange for Joseph's knowledge of sustainable methods. Thomas stared at the document, recognizing his ancestor's signature at the bottom. "I never knew about this. There's nothing in our family records about a partnership with anyone named Harrington." "The partnership was relatively brief by design," Eleanor explained. "According to the terms, Edward lived and worked here for 2 seasons, learning Joseph's methods, while helping mechanize certain aspects of the operation. After that, Edward returned to Oklahoma and started a small agricultural supply company focused on equipment that supported rather than replaced traditional farming practices. That company eventually grew into Harrington Agricultural Technologies. The revelation hung in the air as Thomas and Nathan processed its implications. Their family had not only maintained these sustainable practices through generations, they had once helped inspire what would become one of the largest agricultural technology companies in the country. "Why didn't the connection between our families continue?" Nathan asked. "If they were partners, why did we lose touch?" Eleanor projected one final document, a letter dated 1942. "This was the last communication we have between them." By this time, Edward's company had begun to grow, focusing increasingly on equipment for larger farming operations as the war effort demanded increased production. Joseph apparently expressed concerns about the direction agriculture was taking. Thomas scanned the letter, noting the respectful but clear disagreement between the two men. Joseph Whitaker had warned about the long-term consequences of prioritizing yield over soil health, while Edward defended the necessity of feeding a nation at war by whatever means necessary. The relationship appears to have ended amicably, but definitely, Eleanor continued. Each man respected the other but had chosen different paths. Edward's company embraced the post-war agricultural boom, eventually becoming a leader in industrial farming technology. The Whitaker farm remained, committed to its traditional methods, even as they became increasingly out of step with mainstream agriculture. Thomas sat back, absorbing this unexpected connection to the past. And now, almost 90 years later, the Harrington Company wants to partner with us again because we stayed the course while the rest of the world went another direction. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. When William Harrington realized the ecological crisis facing modern agriculture, he began researching alternatives. Company historians rediscovered the connection to your family, and preliminary research suggested the Whitaker farm might have maintained its traditional practices. Your farm was already on our list for potential heritage farm designation. So when the Harringtons ended up at our dinner table during that storm, Nathan began. It wasn't entirely coincidence, Eleanor acknowledged. James had been at a conference near here and had your farm on his list of properties to potentially visit. The storm just accelerated the timeline and made the introduction more authentic than a formal corporate approach would have been. Thomas frowned slightly. So they deliberately sought us out. This wasn't just a chance encounter. Eleanor's expression became more serious. The storm and the flat tire were entirely coincidental. James had your farm on a list of dozens to potentially visit over the coming months. But once they found themselves here, experiencing your hospitality and seeing firsthand the quality of what you produce, the connection became immediately apparent. It was, as James described it to me, like watching history come full circle. She pulled out one more document from her portfolio, a personal letter bearing William Harrington's signature. William asked me to deliver this. He felt a personal communication was appropriate given the historical connection. Thomas accepted the sealed envelope, still processing the remarkable story. This is all rather overwhelming. I understand, Eleanor replied sympathetically. Take your time with the decision. The partnership offer stands regardless of this historical connection, though William felt you deserved to know the full context. As Eleanor excused herself to check on Dr. Jackson's progress, Thomas carefully opened William Harrington's letter, finding handwritten pages rather than a formal typed document. Dear Mr. Whitaker, by now, Ms. Vaughan will have shared with you the remarkable historical connection between our families. When I first learned of it some years ago, I was struck by the irony. While Harrington Agricultural Technologies grew into an industry leader by embracing industrial farming methods, your family maintained the very practices my grandfather had once traveled to learn. The painful truth is that our company's success came at a cost we did not fully appreciate until recently. In pursuing efficiency and yield, we helped create systems that are now threatening the very foundation of agriculture itself, the living soil beneath our feet. Your great-grandfather warned of this. In his final letter to my grandfather, he predicted that treating soil as merely a medium for chemical inputs rather than a living ecosystem would eventually lead to collapse. It has taken nearly a century, but that prediction is now being born. Out across millions of acres of farmland worldwide, the Heritage Farm Partnership we are proposing is not merely a business arrangement. For me, it represents a form of redemption, a chance to acknowledge that Joseph Whitaker was right, and to help preserve and propagate the wisdom that my family once turned away from. Your farm stands as living proof that there has always been another way, a path not taken by mainstream agriculture, but preserved through your family's commitment to principles over profit. The practices your ancestors maintained, often at great financial sacrifice, may now hold the key to agriculture's sustainable future. Whatever you decide regarding our proposal, please know that I personally hold your family's legacy in the highest esteem. The Whitaker commitment to stewardship across generations represents the very best of American farming tradition. With deep respect, William Harrington Thomas folded the letter carefully, his weathered hands slightly unsteady with the weight of its significance. The burden of maintaining traditional methods through decades when they were considered backward and uneconomical had often felt like a curse, a stubborn adherence to outdated practices that had kept the farm perpetually struggling while neighbors who embraced modern methods prospered, at least temporarily. Now, that same stubborn adherence was being recognized not as backwardness, but as foresight. The practices that had marginalized them economically had preserved something of immeasurable value ecologically. "What does it say?" Nathan asked quietly, respecting his father's moment of reflection. Thomas handed him the letter. "It says, your great-grandfather was right all along, and that the Harringtons want to help make sure his wisdom doesn't get lost to history." As Nathan read, Thomas walked to the old oak desk in the corner of the room, unlocking the bottom drawer where the family's most important documents were kept. From a worn leather folder, he extracted a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon, the farm journals his grandmother had insisted he preserve, though he'd rarely examined them himself. Carefully untying the ribbon, he spread the yellowed pages on the table. His great-grandfather's distinctive handwriting filled page after page with detailed observations of soil conditions, crop rotations, weather patterns, and natural pest management techniques. Interspersed were philosophical reflections on the farmer's duty to the land and future generations. One entry from October 1942 caught his eye. Edward's last letter arrived today. Our paths have diverged for good, it seems. He believes the future lies in mechanization and chemistry, controlling nature rather than partnering with it. I cannot follow him down that road, though I understand the pressures he faces. I will continue as I always have, as my father taught me. The soil is not just dirt to be exploited, but a living community we are entrusted to steward. Someday, when the limits of industrial methods become apparent, perhaps these practices I maintain will prove their worth again. Until then, we will remain the oddity, the holdouts against progress, as others define it. Mary worries about the financial implications, but some principles must transcend immediate profit. Future generations will need living soil, not just high yields for a few decades followed by dust. Thomas looked up from the journal to find Nathan watching him, William Harrington's letter still in his hand. Great-Grandpa Joe knew this day would come, Thomas said softly. He just didn't expect it would take nearly a century. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. Jackson stood there, her eyes alight with excitement, mud smudging her cheeks and clothing in a way that suggested she'd been enthusiastically digging in the fields. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I had to show you this immediately," she exclaimed, holding up a tablet displaying complex microbial analysis graphs. "We've just run preliminary DNA sequencing on soil samples from your North Field, and the results are extraordinary. There's a symbiotic fungal network present that we've only previously documented in undisturbed old-growth forest systems." Her excitement was so genuine that Thomas couldn't help but smile, despite not fully understanding the technical details she was sharing. "And that's, good?" "Good! It's revolutionary," she exclaimed. "This kind of soil ecosystem was thought to be impossible to maintain in agricultural settings. Your family has somehow preserved what the rest of modern farming destroyed decades ago." She paused, seeming to realize her fervor might be overwhelming. "I'm sorry, I get carried away. But what you have here isn't just a farm, Mr. Whitaker. It's a living agricultural museum, a precious reservoir of biodiversity that could help us restore damaged ecosystems across the country." As Dr. Jackson continued explaining her findings, using terms that exceeded Thomas's agricultural vocabulary, despite his lifetime of farming experience, he found himself viewing his land through new eyes. The fields he'd walked since childhood, that his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had tended before him, were apparently far more remarkable than he'd ever imagined. Eleanor rejoined them, her expression apologetic. "I see Amara has already shared her excitement. We're discovering that your farm's soil contains microbial communities that have essentially disappeared from modern agricultural land. It's like finding a living dinosaur, something that was thought to be extinct, still thriving here because of your family's practices." By evening, the Harrington team had departed, leaving Thomas and Nathan to process the day's revelations. They sat on the porch swing that Thomas's grandfather had built, watching twilight settle over the fields that had just been revealed as far more extraordinary than they'd ever suspected. "So," Nathan said finally, breaking the contemplative silence, "are we going to sign the partnership agreement?" Thomas gazed at the hand-built stone wall that marked the farm's eastern boundary, constructed by his ancestors from rocks cleared from the fields over generations. "I think we have to, not just for ourselves, but for them." He gestured toward the family cemetery visible on the small rise beyond the apple orchard, where 4 generations of Whitakers rested. They kept these practices alive when everyone said they were foolish. "We owe it to them to make sure that wisdom doesn't die with us." "It won't," Nathan promised. "With or without the Harrington partnership, I'd already decided to maintain our traditional methods, but with their resources behind us, we can do more than just survive. We can help show other farmers there's a different way forward." Thomas nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even fully acknowledged was there. The fear that the family legacy would end with him, that the farm would be sold to developers or consolidated into some massive industrial operation. After he was gone, your great-grandfather would be proud to know his stubbornness is finally being vindicated. "Not just vindicated," Nathan added, "celebrated. The very things that made us the odd ones out all these years are what make the farm invaluable now." The following morning, Thomas and Nathan signed the Heritage Farm Partnership Agreement in the same kitchen where Thomas had once stared despairingly at a foreclosure notice. Eleanor Vaughan and James Harrington represented the company, bringing along a bottle of champagne to mark the occasion. "Welcome to the Heritage Farm Network," James said, raising his glass in a toast. "Or perhaps I should say, welcome back. Your family helped inspire this approach to agriculture nearly a century ago. It seems fitting that you should be among the first to join its modern incarnation." As they clinked glasses, Thomas felt a sense of rightness settle over him. "To coming full circle," he offered. "And to Joseph Whitaker and Edward Harrington," James added, 2 men who understood, in their different ways, the importance of working with the land rather than against it. After the paperwork was complete, and the Harrington representatives had departed, promising to return soon with the first phase of infrastructure improvement plans, Thomas found himself alone in the fields that had sustained his family for generations. The afternoon sun warmed his face as he knelt to take a handful of soil, letting it sift through his fingers with new appreciation for the complex ecosystem it contained. His phone chimed with a text message from Nathan, who had gone into town to share their news with Marion Jenkins. "Local paper wants to do a story about the Heritage Farm Partnership. Says it could inspire other farmers in the region. Okay to give interview." Thomas smiled slightly, imagining how his traditionally private father and grandfather might have reacted to such publicity. But times had changed, and perhaps this was part of the farm's new purpose, not just to preserve these methods, but to help propagate them again. "Yes," he texted back. "Tell them we're ready to share our story." As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, Thomas noticed a flash of movement at the farm's entrance. A sleek black car was approaching, not one of the now familiar Harrington vehicles, but something different. He hadn't been expecting more visitors today. The car parked near the barn, and from it emerged an elderly man leaning on a carved wooden cane, his white hair contrasting with his tailored dark suit. Despite his obvious age, he carried himself with dignity and purpose as he carefully made his way toward Thomas. With a jolt of recognition, Thomas realized this must be William Harrington himself, the patriarch whose letter had so moved him, the son of Edward Harrington, who had once partnered with Thomas's great-grandfather all those decades ago. What Thomas Whitaker couldn't yet know was that William Harrington's unexpected personal visit would reveal the final piece of the historical connection between their families, a secret that had remained hidden in the Harrington Company archives for nearly 90 years, one that would transform not just the future of Whitaker Farm, but Thomas's understanding of his own family's legacy and its importance to agricultural history. Thomas Whitaker. The elderly man's voice carried surprising strength despite his advanced years as he approached across the farmyard. "Yes," Thomas replied, extending his hand. "And you must be William Harrington." The older man's handshake was firm and purposeful. "Indeed. I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit. There are some matters I felt should be discussed in person rather than through intermediaries, no matter how capable Eleanor and my son might be." Thomas gestured toward the farmhouse. "Please come inside. The walk from the car must have been taxing." William Harrington smiled slightly. "At 87, everything becomes taxing, Mr. Whitaker, but some journeys are worth the effort." Inside the kitchen, Thomas offered tea, which the elderly businessman accepted with appreciation. As Thomas prepared it, William's gaze traveled around the farmhouse interior, taking in the generations of family photographs, the well-worn furniture that spoke of utility valued over fashion, and the subtle signs of careful preservation despite limited resources. "Your home reminds me of my grandfather's descriptions of this place," William remarked. "He kept detailed journals of his time here, said it was the most important education of his life, though at the time he was nearly 40 years old, and thought he understood farming." Thomas placed the steaming mugs on the table, settling across from his unexpected visitor. "Ms. Vaughan shared some of that history with us today. I had no idea our families had any connection, let alone one so significant." William nodded, his fingers tracing the grain of the oak table. "Few people do. The divergence between our paths after their partnership ended made it convenient to minimize the connection. My grandfather built an agricultural empire based on industrial methods. Your family remained committed to traditional practices that the market increasingly undervalued." He looked up, his eyes sharp despite his age. "But history has a way of coming full circle, doesn't it?" "So it seems," Thomas agreed, "though I'm still trying to understand why the Harrington Company would invest so substantially in a small farm like ours, historical connection or not." William smiled. "Direct and practical, family traits that have apparently persisted through generations. Joseph Whitaker was described the same way in my grandfather's journals." He took a careful sip of tea before continuing. "Did you have a chance to read my letter?" "I did. It was illuminating, but not entirely complete," William acknowledged. "There are aspects of our shared history that I felt should be delivered in person, particularly given the partnership your family is considering." From an inner pocket of his suit jacket, William extracted a small leather-bound book. This is my grandfather's private journal from 1935-1936, the period of his partnership with Joseph Whitaker. Our company historians discovered it only recently in a collection of personal effects that had remained sealed according to his will. He carefully opened the worn volume, finding a marked page. "There's an entry here I believe you should hear," he began to read in a clear voice. April 17th, 1936. Joe Whitaker continues to astound me with his intuitive understanding of ecological balance. While agricultural science pushes toward greater specialization and chemical intervention, he operates from principles I can only describe as generational wisdom. Practices passed down and refined through careful observation rather than laboratory experimentation. Today, he showed me soil samples from neighboring farms that have adopted the new commercial fertilizers. Under his microscope, the difference was undeniable. Their soil resembled lifeless medium, while his teemed with microorganisms. "Life begets life," he told me. "You cannot grow living food in dead soil." I find myself increasingly torn between the economic realities of modern agriculture and the undeniable wisdom of Joe's methods. The market demands standardization, efficiency, and ever-increasing yields, while nature demands diversity, patience, and balance. Can these opposing forces be reconciled, or must we choose? Joe believes the pursuit of maximum yield at the expense of soil health is ultimately self-defeating, that we are creating a system destined to collapse once the accumulated biological capital of our soils is depleted. I fear he may be right, but I also fear that economic pressures will force agriculture in precisely the direction he warns against, regardless of the long-term consequences. William looked up from the journal. My grandfather faced a choice between economic expediency and ecological wisdom. Like most of his generation, he chose the former. The company he built helped transform American agriculture into an industrial process, efficient, productive, but ultimately extractive rather than regenerative. "And now you're trying to change direction," Thomas observed. William nodded. "Before it's too late. Which brings me to the real purpose of my visit today." He closed the journal and placed it on the table between them. "The Heritage Farm partnership we've proposed is only the beginning of what I hope will be a much more significant transformation, both for your farm and for agriculture more broadly." From his briefcase, William extracted a folder containing documents different from those Thomas had reviewed with his attorney. What I'm about to share goes beyond the formal partnership proposal. This represents my personal vision for the Whitaker-Harrington Legacy Initiative. Thomas accepted the folder with interest. Inside, he found detailed plans for what appeared to be a comprehensive agricultural education center based around Whitaker Farm, along with funding proposals, architectural renderings, and curriculum outlines. "I don't understand," Thomas said, looking up from the documents. "This looks like plans for some kind of agricultural school." "That's exactly what it is," William confirmed. "The Heritage Farm Network is our company's broad initiative to preserve traditional agricultural knowledge. This," he tapped the folder, "is something more specific. A complete educational institute dedicated to training the next generation of farmers in regenerative methods built around your family's living example." The scope of the proposal was breathtaking. The Whitaker-Harrington Institute would maintain the historical integrity of the original farm while adding carefully designed educational facilities, student housing in the form of small, sustainable cabins, research laboratories built to blend with the rural landscape, and demonstration fields where traditional methods would be taught alongside appropriate modern innovations. "This would be transformative," Thomas said, struggling to find adequate words for the scale of the vision. "Precisely the intention," William agreed. Not just for your farm, but for agricultural education itself, rather than teaching farming. As an industrial process in conventional academic settings, we would bring students to a living example of sustainable agriculture in practice across generations. But why here? Why us? Thomas asked, still grappling with the enormity of what was being proposed. Surely there are larger operations better positioned for this kind of development. William's expression became more solemn. Because authenticity, it cannot be manufactured, Mr. Whitaker. Your family has maintained these practices through decades when they were economically disadvantageous, because you believed they were right. That moral conviction is precisely what the next generation of farmers needs to witness and absorb. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more personal tone. May I speak frankly about my motivations, beyond the corporate interests I represent? Thomas nodded, intrigued by the shift in the elderly man's demeanor. I am in the twilight of my life, Mr. Whitaker. Like many men of my generation who achieved conventional success, I find myself increasingly concerned with legacy, with what remains after I'm gone. The agricultural systems my family's company helped propagate are proving unsustainable. That is a difficult reality to confront in one's final years. The admission carried a vulnerability that seemed at odds with the powerful businessman's public persona, and Thomas found himself moved by the candor. Your family maintained the path not taken, William continued, the path my grandfather glimpsed during his time here, but ultimately rejected in favor of industrial efficiency. I believe that path now represents our best hope for a sustainable agricultural future. This institute would be a form of redemption, a chance to acknowledge where we went wrong and help redirect agriculture toward more sustainable models before it's too late. And my family's role in this institute? Thomas asked, beginning to see the full implications of the proposal. Central and essential, William replied without hesitation. The Whitaker family would maintain complete ownership of the original farm, with additional adjacent land acquired for expansion. You and Nathan would serve as the Institute's founding directors if you choose, with substantial compensation and complete autonomy over agricultural practices. Most importantly, your family's methods and philosophy would form the core curriculum, finally recognized for their wisdom rather than dismissed as outdated. As Thomas continued reviewing the detailed proposal, the scale of the vision became increasingly clear. The Institute would not be merely an educational facility, but a living demonstration of agricultural alternatives. A place where farmers from across the country could come to learn regenerative methods tested and refined through generations of practice. This would require significant changes to our current operation, Thomas observed. We've never managed anything beyond the farm itself, let alone an educational institute. William nodded acknowledgement, which is precisely why the proposal includes a comprehensive transition plan. The institute wouldn't emerge overnight, but would develop organically over 5 years, with professional administrative support provided throughout. Your role would be focused on what you know best, the agricultural methods that make your farm unique, not paperwork or logistics. As the afternoon light shifted through the kitchen windows, Thomas and William continued discussing the proposal, exploring its implications not just for Whitaker Farm, but for agricultural education more broadly. The elderly businessman answered Thomas's practical questions with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime managing complex enterprises, while never losing sight of the larger vision that clearly drove him. There's one more thing you should see, William said finally, reaching into his briefcase once more. He extracted a sealed envelope similar to the one Eleanor had delivered earlier, but bearing older, yellowed paper. This was found with my grandfather's journal. It was never delivered, for reasons that will become apparent when you read it. Thomas accepted the envelope, noting that it was addressed to Joseph Whitaker in careful handwriting, postmarked 1947, but never opened. With William's encouraging nod, he carefully broke the seal and extracted the letter inside. "Dear Joe, it has been 5 years since our last correspondence, and much has changed in the world and in agriculture. My company has grown substantially, riding the wave of post-war agricultural expansion and new technologies that promise to revolutionize farming as we know it. On the surface, it would appear our paths have diverged completely. Your commitment to traditional methods and my embrace of industrial agriculture seem to represent opposing visions for farming's future. The market has, for now, favored my approach. Efficiency and standardization are the watchwords of this new era, and my equipment supports exactly these qualities. And yet, I find myself increasingly troubled by certain developments. The new chemical pesticides and fertilizers, while undeniably effective in the short term, raise questions about long-term soil health that echo your warnings from years ago. The drive toward monoculture and away from diversified farming eliminates the natural balances you so carefully maintained. In quiet moments, I wonder if we have set agriculture on a path that mistakes short-term productivity for sustainable abundance. I find myself returning to the principles you demonstrated during my time at your farm. Principles I understood intellectually but failed to defend when economic pressures pushed in another direction. I am writing because my son, William, has recently taken an interest in our company's operations. He is young, just 15, but shows remarkable aptitude for both business and agriculture. I would like to send him to spend a summer at your farm, to learn what I learned from you before his perspectives are fully formed by conventional agricultural education. The future may eventually prove one of us right and the other wrong. If it is you who history vindicates, I want at least one member of the next generation of Harringtons to understand the alternative to the path we are now pursuing with such confidence. Please let me know if this would be agreeable to you. Regardless of our different approaches, I have never forgotten the wisdom you shared so generously, and I remain your friend and fellow cultivator, Edward Harrington Thomas, looked up from the letter, a question in his eyes. My grandfather died suddenly 2 weeks after writing this, William explained quietly. A heart attack while inspecting a new production facility. The letter was never sent. I never had the opportunity to spend that summer here, learning what he had learned. I'm sorry, Thomas said simply. William nodded acknowledgement. When our company historians discovered this letter recently, it affected me deeply. My grandfather, at the height of his success pioneering industrial agricultural equipment, harbored private doubts. He recognized the wisdom in your great-grandfather's methods even as market forces drove agriculture in the opposite direction. And now you want to fulfill his intention, Thomas surmised, by sending not just your son, but many young people to learn these methods. Exactly, William confirmed, though far later than he intended. The question is whether the Whitaker family is willing to take on this larger mission, to transform your private agricultural practice into a teaching legacy that could influence farming for generations to come. Thomas rose from the table, needing movement to process the enormity of what was being proposed. He walked to the window that overlooked the fields his family had tended for nearly a century, fields that had been maintained according to principles that the broader agricultural world had long dismissed as outdated and uneconomical. I need to discuss this with Nathan, he said finally. This goes far beyond what we were expecting from the partnership proposal. Of course, William agreed, rising somewhat stiffly from his chair. There's no rush on this particular decision. The Heritage Farm Partnership can proceed regardless. This additional vision would develop over time, with your family's full input and consent at every stage. As Thomas walked William back to his waiting car, the elderly businessman paused to survey the farm with evident appreciation. "Your great-grandfather would be proud," he observed. "Not just that his agricultural methods have been preserved, but that they might now become the foundation for teaching future generations." "I hope so," Thomas replied, "though I suspect he'd be suspicious of such grand plans. He was a practical man who believed in starting small and building gradually." William smiled. "A wisdom that applies to institutions as well as crops. Thank you for hearing an old man's vision, Mr. Whitaker. Whatever you decide, know that I, personally, hold your family's agricultural legacy in the highest esteem." As the black car disappeared down the farm road, Thomas remained standing in the yard, the proposal folder still in his hand, trying to absorb the day's revelations and their implications for the future. Nathan returned from town an hour later, his expression shifting from excitement to concern when he saw his father still sitting on the porch, surrounded by William Harrington's documents. "Dad, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," Thomas replied thoughtfully. "More like a future I never imagined." As the evening shadows lengthened across the land, Thomas shared William Harrington's vision with his son. Nathan's initial disbelief gradually gave way to cautious excitement as he reviewed the detailed proposals for transforming their struggling family farm into the centerpiece of a revolutionary agricultural education initiative. "This is incredible," Nathan said finally, setting aside the architectural renderings of the proposed institute. "It's everything I dreamed of doing with my agricultural degree, but never thought possible on our scale." "It's also a massive change," Thomas cautioned, "not just in the farm's operations, but in our lives. We'd be going from farmers to educators, from private practitioners to public examples." Nathan nodded, understanding his father's reservations. "But isn't that exactly what Great-Grandpa Joe would have wanted? For these methods to be recognized and taught to others? He was apparently willing to teach Edward Harrington back in the 1930s. Teaching one man is different from establishing an entire institute," Thomas pointed out. "And there's something about all this that still unsettles me, the scale of it, the formality. Your great-grandfather believed in direct experience, hands in the soil, not classroom theory." "Then that's how we'd teach," Nathan argued. "The proposal specifically emphasizes experiential learning, not abstract academics. Students would work these fields alongside us, learning by doing just as our family always has." Their discussion continued through dinner and into the evening, weighing the potential benefits against the inevitable challenges of such a transformation. For every concern Thomas raised, Nathan found an answer within the carefully crafted proposal, evidence that William Harrington had anticipated their reservations and addressed them thoughtfully. "You know what this reminds me of?" Thomas said finally, as they sat on the porch watching the first stars appear. "That story your grandfather used to tell about Joseph and the agricultural conference in Chicago, how he stood up in front of all those government experts and told them they were approaching soil all wrong, that they needed to work with nature rather than trying to control it." Nathan nodded, "and they mostly dismissed him as a backward farmer, unwilling to modernize." "Exactly. But Edward Harrington listened. He recognized the wisdom in those traditional methods, even if he ultimately chose another path." Thomas gazed out at the darkening fields. "Now, 90 years later, his grandson is suggesting that your great-grandfather was right all along, that those dismissed methods might hold the key to agriculture's sustainable future. And our family maintained them all this time," Nathan added, "through decades when they made no economic sense, when all the pressure was to adopt industrial methods, chemical inputs, and monoculture. We stayed the course." Because your great-grandfather believed it was right, Thomas said simply, and each generation after him respected that wisdom enough to continue, even when it meant struggling financially while neighbors who modernized seemed to prosper. Until now, Nathan observed, when suddenly those backward methods are being recognized as visionary. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the farm basking in early autumn sunshine that gilded the fields and burnished the weathered red barn to a deep crimson. Thomas rose before dawn, as he always had, completing his essential chores with the efficiency of long practice, his mind still turning over the monumental decision before them. As he returned from the barn, he found Nathan already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with fresh coffee and the Whitaker-Harrington Institute proposal spread before him, making notes and sketches in a manner reminiscent of his great-grandfather's. Careful farm planning. I've been thinking about how we could phase this in, Nathan said without preamble. Start small, with weekend workshops for local farmers, then gradually expand to longer programs as we build capacity. We could begin with the Heritage Farm Partnership to stabilize our finances, then transition toward the Institute model over 3 years rather than 5. Thomas poured himself coffee, smiling slightly at his son's enthusiasm. You've already decided, haven't you? Nathan looked up, his expression a mixture of excitement and determination. Dad, all my life I've watched you maintain these methods, not because they were profitable, but because they were right. I went to agricultural college hoping to find ways to make our approach economically viable without compromising its principles. He gestured at the proposal. This is beyond anything I could have imagined, a chance to not just sustain our farm, but to help transform agriculture itself. Thomas nodded slowly. Your great-grandfather used to say that farming isn't just about growing crops, it's about growing future possibilities. He meant it literally, that how we treat the soil determines what future generations will be able to produce from it. Exactly, Nathan agreed eagerly. And now we have a chance to grow future possibilities in an even broader sense, by teaching these methods to a new generation of farmers. Thomas sipped his coffee thoughtfully. William Harrington said something yesterday that stuck with me. He said authenticity can't be manufactured, that what makes our farm valuable as a teaching example is that we maintained these practices through decades when they were economically disadvantageous because we believed they were right. And that moral conviction is what future farmers need to witness, Nathan finished. I couldn't agree more. Modern agriculture faces pressures from all sides, economic, environmental, social. Farmers need more than techniques. They need a philosophical foundation for their work. As morning brightened toward noon, their discussion evolved from whether to accept William Harrington's vision to how they might implement it while remaining true to the Whitaker family's agricultural philosophy. By the time Eleanor Vaughan called to check on their decision regarding the initial Heritage Farm Partnership, they had developed a clear vision for the more ambitious Institute concept. We're prepared to move forward with the Heritage Farm Agreement, Thomas told her, and we'd like to discuss William's additional proposal as well, but we have some ideas about approaching it differently than outlined in his initial concept. Eleanor's voice conveyed both surprise and pleasure. That's wonderful news, Thomas. I'll arrange a meeting at your convenience. May I ask what modifications you're considering to the Institute proposal? We believe the development should be more organic and gradual, Thomas explained, starting with the working farm as the foundation and adding educational components that grow naturally from actual agricultural practice, less emphasis on formal facilities at first, more on direct experience in the fields. That sounds very much in keeping with your family's philosophy, Eleanor observed. I think William will be receptive to that approach. His primary concern is preserving and propagating the agricultural wisdom your family has maintained, not the specific form of the institution. By the following week, The Heritage Farm Partnership Agreement had been officially signed, and initial planning meetings for the longer-term institute were underway. The news spread quickly through the agricultural community, generating interest from neighboring farmers who had long viewed the Whitakers' methods with a mixture of respect and skepticism. On a crisp autumn morning, 3 months after the Harringtons had first arrived on his doorstep during a storm, Thomas stood in the field that had nearly been lost to financial pressure, watching as Dr. Jackson and her team installed sophisticated soil monitoring equipment designed to document the unique biology of the farm's living soil without disrupting its natural processes. "We're already seeing remarkable data," she told him excitedly, showing him preliminary readings on her tablet. "The microbial diversity here exceeds anything in our reference samples by orders of magnitude. It's like comparing a thriving rainforest to a tree plantation." Thomas nodded, not fully understanding the technical details, but appreciating the validation of practices his family had maintained through generations. "The really extraordinary thing," Dr. Jackson continued, "is that we're finding evidence of consistent soil building over decades, even during periods of climatic stress. Most agricultural soils show degradation over time, but yours actually improves, becoming more resilient, more diverse, more alive with each passing year. My great-grandfather used to say, 'We're not just farming this season's crops, we're farming the foundation for all future seasons,'" Thomas replied. "Every decision we make either builds that foundation or weakens it." Dr. Jackson looked up from her equipment, her expression thoughtful. "That's precisely the philosophy modern agriculture needs to rediscover, viewing farming as a long-term relationship with the land rather than a series of annual production cycles." As she returned to her work, Thomas walked toward the farmhouse, where Nathan was conducting the first of what would become regular tours for farmers interested in the Whitaker methods. A small group followed him through the fields, listening intently as he explained crop rotation strategies, composting techniques, and natural pest management approaches that had been refined through generations of practice. Among the visitors, Thomas recognized several neighboring farmers who had previously dismissed their methods as outdated, men who had embraced chemical agriculture and maximized short-term yields at the expense of long-term soil health. Their presence now, asking thoughtful questions about regenerative practices, represented a shift in agricultural consciousness that extended far beyond one family farm. At the edge of the property, architectural stakes marked the boundary of what would eventually become the first phase of the Whitaker-Harrington Institute, a modest educational facility designed to complement rather than dominate the working farm. The plans had been revised according to Thomas and Nathan's vision, emphasizing experiential learning over formal instruction, practical application over theory. As Thomas surveyed the land that had supported his family for generations, land that would now support a new kind of growth through education, he felt a profound sense of continuity with the past and hope for the future. The farm that had struggled for decades to remain economically viable while maintaining ecological integrity would now become a model for a more balanced approach to agriculture, one that honored both economic needs and environmental responsibilities. What had begun with a simple act of hospitality toward a family stranded in a storm had revealed itself as part of a much larger story, a narrative about alternative paths in agriculture, about wisdom preserved through generations, and about the potential for reconciliation between traditional knowledge and modern challenges. The private jet that had seemed so out of place on his farm had delivered not just financial rescue, but the recognition that his family's stubborn adherence to traditional methods represented not backwardness, but foresight. A living example. Of the road not taken by industrial agriculture, a road that might now offer the best hope for a sustainable future. As the seasons turned and the Whitaker-Harrington Institute took shape, the story of the farmer who shared his harvest with a stranded family spread far beyond the local community, becoming a powerful parable about generosity rewarded, wisdom recognized, and the unexpected ways that remaining true to one's principles can ultimately transform not just individual lives, but entire systems. And at the center of it all remained the fertile fields of Whitaker Farm, fields that had sustained a family for generations and would now help nurture a new approach to agriculture, one that honored the past while cultivating hope for the future. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.